So today we're going to take a look at something a little bit different from what I normally talk about on the channel. We'll take a break from talking about spaceships and galactic conflicts to talk about something closer to home. Let's talk about one of the most influential and one of my personal favorite pieces of science fiction, the War of the Worlds. And specifically, let's talk about the Martian War Machines, the alien tripods from the War of the Worlds. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. Now, I know this is very different from what I've talked about in the past. I talk a lot about Expanse and Star Wars and stuff like that, but this is a science fiction franchise and a science fiction IP that's very, very near and dear to me. I grew up really enjoying the War of the Worlds and really liking the sort of dynamics of the way the Martian invasion of Earth was depicted by Wells and the way it was adapted throughout history over the past 100 years to be stories from different periods of time. So I figured today we could take a look at one of the most iconic pieces of equipment utilized by the Martians during their invasion, and maybe go over how it's designed and how it's used. One more thing before I begin, I will be talking a lot about the War Machines from the original novel, the book written by H.G. Wells in the 1890s, but obviously, because it's a book, there's not many visuals, so instead I'll be using a lot of visuals from the 2005 Spielberg movie and from the BBC series that came out just a few years ago. So let's just jump right in with some statistics. Well, we don't know a lot of specifics about things like height. We do know that they were rather large. These tripod war machines stood far taller than anything around them, at least when they emerged from the pits in Horsell Common outside of London, and they were described as towering over the trees and the buildings of Woking, one of the nearby towns. Standing on 3 legs, the tripod, interestingly, is described as appearing to have been from an engineering society that lacked the wheel. There are no hinges or ball joints on board to speak of, instead everything being mostly piston-based. While it's not specifically said, there's a strong impression given that the vehicle is powered primarily by a steam-like system, since it's described as having puffs of green smoke coming out of its joints and moving rather lumberingly through the trees. Atop these 3 tripod legs was a head that's been described in various ways throughout fiction, but ultimately it's most commonly depicted as a saucer-like shape with a pair of eyes either underneath or above it. Around the rim of its saucer-like head were an array of tentacles used for interacting with their environment, be that grabbing trees or grabbing fleeing people. And what would it do with those fleeing people? Well, it would put them on a basket mounted to the back of the head of the tripod. What about weapons? Well, the tentacles are terrifying, but they're not the Martians' primary weapon. The primary weapon utilized by the Martians is their heat ray. The heat ray is described as a flicker of light off a mirror inside of a box, casting an invisible beam that anything the beam falls upon bursts into flames. Actually, very similar to a modern laser, which is impressive because this is far ahead of the discovery or really invention of lasers. Now, it's noteworthy that a lot of the visual adaptations of the War of the Worlds over the past few years let go of the invisible beam of light in favor for something more modern, the idea of a glowing beam of fire, but in the book it is described as an invisible flicker of light, and actually the BBC series from a few years ago does a pretty good job representing this, where you don't actually see the beam, just the destruction it's causing. The other primary weapon of the Martians is their black smoke, which is a chemical weapon, as the name would suggest. These smoke canisters are fired out of shoulder-mounted artillery pieces that are carried separately from the war machine, sort of like a shoulder-mounted rocket launcher. And when fired, the projectile arcs and then impacts the ground, dispersing a black smoke that kills anything that breathes it in, and the smoke eventually settles in low-lying areas. The only way to dissipate the smoke is a mist jet that can be released by the war machines themselves. Interestingly, there are a few things that we should note about the war machines from the original novel. First off, unlike most modern adaptations of the War of the Worlds, they weren't invincible. We see at several points throughout the book military forces being able to actually bring down the tripods. They're not protected by shields or anything crazy like that. They're just very good at finding and destroying enemies, and usually when one is destroyed, 2 more descend on those that destroyed it, since these war machines always worked in packs of 3. Modern adaptations to make the aliens seem more threatening have usually made them some form of invincible, whether it's protected by a shield or simply just really sturdy armor. One last thing I'd like to mention about the original novel that is often overlooked is that in the original novel, the Martians aren't sending this massive invasion force, but instead a group of roughly 30 war machines, targeted only at Great Britain. The idea possibly being if we can topple the largest and most powerful country on Earth, we can take a position of dominance on that planet and don't need to carry out a global planetary invasion. In more modern renditions, it's depicted as a global event affecting countries all over the world. But the War of the Worlds has always been a pretty big part of my life and the things I like from science fiction. I don't talk much about alien invasion fiction on this channel, but I really do love a good classic alien invasion story, and I think War of the Worlds is one of the best within that category. I read it for the first time back in high school and just fell in love with the concepts displayed in the story. So my question for you guys is, do you like me covering stuff like this on the channel? Do you want to see more content about alien invasions and maybe even more stuff about War of the Worlds specifically? There's a lot of other really fascinating little bits that H.G. Wells was able to slip into his original novel, and even things that have been added over the years to various renditions of it. And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover anywhere else in science fiction, War of the Worlds, or really anything else, let me know down below. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.